The wind howled like a broken guitar string the moment I heard the truck rumble into the driveway, a sound that snapped me out of my haze and sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the October chill. I'd been waiting for Miles all day, my fingers hovering over the frets of my beat-up Gibson, picking out a melody that refused to find its shape. "Come on, June," I muttered to myself, my voice bouncing off the wooden walls of our little house in Cannon Beach, Oregon. "You're losing it. Get the damn chord right." But then the front door banged open, and everything I thought I knew about my life splintered like a dropped glass. I'm Juniper Callahan, June to anyone who matters, 32 years old and clinging to the ghost of a music career that peaked 5 years ago with a song called Driftwood Soul. It hit number 98 on some indie chart, enough to buy this creaky house 2 miles from the Pacific, where the salt air seeps into everything and the pines outside whisper secrets I can't quite hear. I was sitting there in my favorite leather jacket, the one with frayed cuffs I'd worn since I was 25, paired with boots so scuffed they look like they've walked through a war zone. My hair's a mess of chestnut curls I haven't bothered to tame, and I'd been talking to myself again, running lines for a song character who kept telling me I was off-key. That's how I work through the block, how I pretend I've still got something left to say. But when Miles walked in, dragging a suitcase that wasn't his, and a shadow I didn't recognize, the notes in my head turned to static. He looked different. Miles Callahan, my husband of 6 years, all 6 feet of him with that messy brown hair I used to run my fingers through, stood there in the doorway like a stranger who'd forgotten his lines. His hazel eyes wouldn't meet mine, darting instead to the woman beside him. Raven Delgado. I knew her name before he said it, knew her face from the Instagram posts Miles liked late at night when he thought I was asleep. She was tall, maybe 5'8", with jet black hair spilling over her shoulders, and a smirk that said she owned the room before she even stepped into it. She wore an oversized sweater that hung off one shoulder, dragging a suitcase behind her like she was moving in for good. My stomach twisted into a knot tighter than the strings on my guitar. "June," Miles said, his voice low and unsteady, like he was testing the waters before jumping in. "Raven's gonna stay with us for a while. She's in a bind down in Cali, and I couldn't just leave her hanging." The words hit me like a slap, sharp and unexpected. I nearly dropped the Gibson onto the hardwood floor, my fingers frozen mid-chord. Raven tilted her head, that half-smile curling her lips as she stepped forward, her boots clicking against the planks. "Hope it's not a hassle, June," she said, her tone smooth as polished glass. "I won't be any trouble. Promise." Trouble. The word hung in the air, thick and heavy, like the fog rolling in off the ocean. I stood up, setting the guitar against the arm of the chair, my hands trembling just enough to betray me. Miles still wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on some invisible spot near the fireplace we hadn't lit in months. "Since when?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay even, though it felt like I was shouting over a storm. "When did we decide this, Miles? Because I don't remember signing up for a roommate." He shifted his weight, scuffing his work boots against the rug we'd picked out together at a flea market in Portland 3 summers ago. "It's just temporary," he mumbled. "A few weeks, tops." "She's my friend, June. You know that." I did know that. Raven wasn't a stranger, not entirely. She'd been Miles's shadow since their college days at Oregon State, popping up in stories he'd tell over beers at the Rusty Anchor, our local dive. The artsy photographer with a laugh that could charm a room, the one who'd backpacked through Europe while I was still busking on street corners for gas money. I'd never liked her, not from the first time I met her at a barbecue 4 years back when she'd sized me up like I was a chord progression she could rewrite. But Miles always brushed it off. "You're imagining things, June," he'd say with that easy grin that used to melt me. "She's just Raven." Now she was here, in my house, and that grin was nowhere to be found. The room felt smaller with her in it, the walls closing in like the set of a play I hadn't rehearsed for. I glanced at the window, where the gray sky pressed against the glass, and wondered how long I'd been blind to whatever this was. "A few weeks?" I repeated, tasting the lie in his words. "And you didn't think to call? Text? Give me a heads up so I don't feel like I'm the last one to know what's happening in my own damn life?" My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated myself for it. Raven raised an eyebrow, her suitcase still clutched in one hand, but she didn't say anything. Miles rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he'd had since we met. 8 years ago, in that Portland cafe where he'd spilt latte on my shirt and won me over with an apology and a concert ticket. "It's not like that," he said, finally meeting my eyes for half a second before looking away again. "I didn't want to stress you out. You've been so caught up in your music lately, and I figured it'd be fine." Fine. The word landed like a sour note, jarring and wrong. I opened my mouth to argue, to demand answers, but Raven cut in. Her voice soft and deliberate. "I'll stay out of your way, June. Really, I just need a place to crash until I get back on my feet." I stared at her, then at Miles, searching for something, anything, to anchor me in this moment that felt like it was slipping out of my hands. The wind rattled the windows, a low moan that matched the unease curling in my chest. This wasn't just a friend crashing on our couch. This was something else, something I couldn't name yet, but I could feel it, sharp and cold as the edge of a blade. And as Raven rolled her suitcase past me toward the guest room, her perfume trailing like a ghost, I knew one thing for sure. My marriage, my home, my whole shaky little world had just been tuned to a key I didn't recognize. The next morning, I woke to the smell of cumin and chili powder snaking through the house, an assault on my senses that yanked me out of a restless sleep. I stumbled into the kitchen, still in my faded Black Sabbath t-shirt and sweatpants, my hair a tangled mess from tossing on the pillow all night. Raven stood at the stove, flipping tortillas in my cast-iron skillet like she'd lived here forever. The sight of her in my space, her long black hair pulled into a careless ponytail, made my jaw clench so hard I thought my teeth might crack. "Morning, June," she chirped, not even turning around. "Making tacos. Want one?" I stared at the mess of salsa jars and onion peels littering my counter, the counter I'd scrubbed clean 2 days ago, and forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. "No thanks," I said, my voice rough from lack of sleep. "I'm more of a coffee and cereal girl." Miles shuffled in behind me, his work boots scuffing the floor, and I caught the faint whiff of his cologne mixed with something else, something floral I didn't recognize. He grabbed a mug from the cupboard, avoiding my eyes like he'd perfected the art overnight. "Smells good, Raven," he said, and the casual warmth in his tone stabbed me right in the gut. I poured coffee into my chipped World's Okayest songwriter mug, watching them move around each other with an ease that made me feel like the outsider. "So," I said, leaning against the counter, "what's the plan today? Raven settling in, or are we pretending this is a weekend getaway?" Miles froze mid-sip, and Raven flicked her gaze to me, her lips twitching into that half-smile I was starting to hate. "Just getting my bearings," she said. "Might borrow that corner by the window later. The light's perfect for some shots." Her photography. Of course. I nodded, sipping my coffee, the bitterness mirroring the taste in my mouth. "Sure, just don't spill salsa on my rug." That night, they disappeared. I'd been strumming my Gibson in the living room, working on a riff that felt like it might actually go somewhere, when I heard the front door creak open and shut. I glanced out the window just in time to see Miles's truck pulling away, Raven in the passenger seat, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. My stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on a staircase. I waited, counting the minutes, then the hours. 3 hours later, they rolled back in, their hair tousled by the ocean wind, laughing about the perfect shot at Haystack Rock. Miles brushed it off when I asked, "Just helping her out, June. You know how she gets about her work." I didn't know, actually, but I let it slide, swallowing the questions piling up like driftwood on the shore. Things got worse from there. Miles started sleeping on the couch, claiming he didn't want to wake me when he got up early for his commute to Portland. I'd lie in our bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint murmur of his voice through the floorboards as he talked on the phone late at night. "It'll be okay," I caught once, soft and tender, a tone he hadn't used with me since we danced barefoot on this very floor after our wedding. Then, one morning, I found Raven in the kitchen wearing his gray hoodie, the one I'd bought him for Christmas last year with "Built Tough" stitched on the sleeve. She tugged at it, grinning. "Miles said I could borrow it. It's freezing in here." I looked at him, waiting for something, anything, but he just shrugged. "She was cold, June. No big deal." No big deal, right. I couldn't take it anymore. That afternoon, I drove the mile down to the Rusty Anchor, the bar where I'd played gigs for the past 3 years. Toby Grayson was behind the counter, all 6'3" and 250 pounds of him, his beard brushing the edge of his flannel shirt as he wiped down the bar with a rag. He'd been my rock since I first stumbled in here with my guitar, broke and desperate for a gig. "You look like hell, June," he said, sliding a beer my way without me asking. I took it, the cold glass grounding me as I spilled everything. Raven, the hoodie, the late-night drives. Toby's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a growl. "Sounds like trouble. If Miles ain't straight with you, I'll straighten him out myself." I laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Hold off on the fists, T-Bone. I need to figure this out my way." The next day, Lila Hawthorne knocked on my door, a tray of oatmeal cookies in her hands and a knowing glint in her gray eyes. She's 60, wiry and sharp, with silver hair tied up in a bun and a collection of antique clocks ticking away in her living room next door. We sat on my porch, the wind tugging at the edges of her scarf, and I told her about Raven over tea that tasted like chamomile and... "She's not just crashing here, Lila," I said, my fingers tightening around the mug. "It's like she's rewriting my life." Lila tilted her head, her glasses catching the dull sunlight. "People hide their worst lies behind pretty masks, June. Keep your eyes open." Her words stuck with me, a quiet warning that buzzed in my head like a bad amp. That night I crossed a line. Miles was in the shower, the water hissing through the pipes, and I saw his phone on the coffee table, screen dark but calling to me. I hesitated, my heart pounding like a kick drum, then snatched it up. The lock code was still our anniversary, 917, and I scrolled through his texts, my breath catching as I found her name. Raven. "You're my light, Miles," one read, sent 2 nights ago. "June doesn't get you like I do." Another from him. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow." Tomorrow. He'd told me he had a meeting in Portland. I dropped the phone as the bathroom door opened, my hands shaking, and when he stepped out, towel around his waist, I couldn't hold it in. "What's this?" I said, holding up a hotel receipt I'd found in his jacket earlier, a $150 charge from 2 months back. His face went pale, water dripping onto the floor. "It's nothing, June, work stuff. Don't make it a thing." But it was a thing. It was everything. I turned away, my chest tight, and stared out the window at the darkening sky. The wind howled louder now, rattling the panes, and I felt it deep in my bones. Something was breaking. Something I couldn't fix with a song or a scream. Raven's laugh echoed from the guest room, light and careless, and Miles's silence filled the space between us like a wall I couldn't climb. I wasn't just losing my husband. I was losing my home, my sanity, and maybe even myself. And I had no idea how to stop it. The air in the house felt like a live wire after I found those texts, crackling with something I couldn't ignore anymore. I stood there by the window, the wind slamming against the glass, my reflection staring back at me like a stranger I didn't want to meet. Miles hovered behind me, dripping wet from his shower, the towel slung low around his hips as he stammered through excuses that sounded like static. June, it's not what you think, he said, his voice tight, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My fingers curled into fists, nails digging into my palms, and I knew I had to get out before I smashed something, maybe his phone, maybe his face. I need air, I muttered, grabbing my jacket and guitar case, and bolted for the door. Raven's voice floated after me from the guest room. Everything okay out there? But I didn't answer. I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. I drove straight to the Rusty Anchor, the miles stretching out like a lifeline. It was Friday night and the place was packed. At least 50 people crammed around sticky tables, the jukebox blaring some old Springsteen tune. Toby spotted me the second I walked in, my boots thudding against the warped floorboards, and he waved me over with a frown that said he already knew something was up. I slid onto a stool, dropping my guitar case beside me, and he didn't even ask before pouring me a shot of whiskey. "Spill it, June," he said, leaning his massive frame across the bar. I downed the shot, the burn cutting through the fog in my chest, and told him everything. The texts, the hoodie, the hotel receipt. His jaw tightened and he slammed a fist on the counter, rattling the bottles behind him. "That son of a bitch! You want me to drag him in here?" I shook my head, my voice trembling but sharp. "Not yet. I need to do this my way." That's when I dragged Miles back with me, practically shoving him through the door of the Rusty Anchor an hour later. The crowd parted as I stormed in, my heart pounding like a drum solo, and I didn't care who heard me. I spun on him, my finger jabbing the air between us. "How long, Miles?" I shouted, loud enough to cut through the noise. "How long have you been screwing Raven behind my back?" His face went white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "June, calm down," he said, glancing around at the gawking faces. "It's not like that." I laughed, a jagged, ugly sound, and yanked his phone from my pocket where I'd stashed it. "Oh, it's exactly like that. Read it, asshole." I shoved the screen in his face, the glow lighting up those damning words. "You're my light, Miles." He stared at it, then at me, and finally the truth spilled out, quiet and broken. 6 months, he admitted, rubbing his hands over his face. "But it's your fault, June. You're always lost in your own world. I needed someone who gets me." "My fault." The words hit like a punch, knocking the wind out of me, but I didn't crumple. I laughed again, louder this time, and grabbed a half-empty beer from the bar, hurling it at the wall where it shattered in a spray of foam and glass. The crowd gasped, Toby stepping forward with a growl, but I waved him off. "Don't," I said, my eyes locked on Miles. "He's not worth it." I turned and walked out, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap, and I didn't look back. Not then. The next morning, I sat on the porch with my guitar, the ocean roaring in the distance, and let the rage simmer into something useful. Toby showed up with coffee and a plan. "Kick 'em both out," he said, cracking his knuckles. "I'll help." But I wanted more than that. I wanted them to feel this, to choke on it. So I hatched a scheme, something twisted and perfect. I pulled up a rental site on my phone, found a rundown studio apartment in Portland, and booked it under Raven's name with Miles's credit card number I'd memorized years ago. The bill came to $1,500 for a month, and I sent it straight to his email with a fake confirmation, "Enjoy your new place, lovebird." Then I turned to my guitar and started writing. For 3 days, I locked myself in the spare room at Toby's place above the bar, the strings cutting into my fingers as I poured everything into a song. The stranger in my mirror came alive, raw and vicious. "You traded my chords for her lies, / now watch me burn your disguise." Every word was a blade, every note a spark, and by the time I finished, my hands were shaking, but my head was clear. Lila stopped by that afternoon, her silver hair glinting in the weak sunlight as she handed me a cup of tea. She didn't say much, just listened as I played her the rough cut, my voice cracking on the high notes. When I finished, she set down her mug and pointed to a broken clock on her shelf. That belonged to my ex, she said, her voice steady. He cheated too. I fixed it to remind myself time's mine, not his. You've got the same power, June. I nodded, her words sinking in like a promise. Saturday night I took the stage at the Rusty Anchor, the room buzzing with regulars and a few of Miles's co-workers I'd tipped off through a mutual friend. My hands were steady as I tuned the Gibson, the spotlight hot on my face. "This one's new," I said into the mic, my voice cutting through the chatter. "Hope you like it." I launched into the song, the chords ringing out like a battle cry, and the crowd leaned in, hooked. Halfway through, the door swung open, and there they were, Miles and Raven, frozen in the entrance, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, his face a mask of panic. I didn't miss a beat. I pointed right at them, singing louder, "Here's the stranger who stole my tune / and the fool who danced to her moon." The room erupted, boos and jeers rising like a wave, and Toby lumbered forward, his voice booming over the chaos. "Get the hell out, both of you," Miles tried to shout back. "June, stop this!" But the crowd drowned him out, hollering and whistling as Raven grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. I finished the last note, my chest heaving, and the place exploded in applause. I stepped off the stage, my boots hitting the floor with a thud, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just revenge. It was a reckoning. Miles and Raven were gone, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. I'd lit the match, and now I'd watch it burn. The echo of that final chord still hummed in my ears as I stepped out of the Rusty Anchor into the night, the ocean wind cutting through my jacket like it wanted to peel me open. The crowd's cheers faded behind the slammed door, replaced by the distant crash of waves and the thump of my own heartbeat. I'd done it. I'd turned my pain into a weapon, flung it right in their faces, and watched them run. But as I stood there on the gravel lot, my breath fogging in the cold, the high of it all started to slip away, leaving a hollow ache I couldn't name. I slung my guitar case over my shoulder and started walking. The mile back to the house, stretching out like a tightrope, I wasn't sure I could cross. Miles called me the next morning, his voice crackling through my phone like a bad recording. "June, I messed up," he said, the words tumbling out fast and desperate. "I'm sorry, can we talk, please?" I stood on Toby's rickety back porch, staring at the gray sky over Cannon Beach, the phone pressed to my ear. Sorry. 6 months of lies boiled down to that one flimsy word. I could hear Raven in the background, her voice sharp and muffled, arguing something I didn't care to catch. "Talk," I said, my laugh bitter enough to sting. "You had 6 months to talk, Miles. That chance is gone." I hung up before he could reply, my thumb hovering over the block button for a split second before I pressed it. Done. I wasn't going back to that house, not yet. Maybe not ever. Toby let me crash in the spare room above the bar, a cramped space with a lumpy mattress and a window that rattled every time the wind picked up. I hauled my guitar and a duffel bag of clothes up the narrow stairs, the smell of stale beer and pine clinging to everything. "Stay as long as you need," he said, handing me a key and a 6-pack of IPA. "But if that bastard shows up, I'm breaking his nose." I grinned, the first real smile I'd felt in days. "Noted, T-Bone." That night, I sat on the edge of the bed, the cans sweating beside me, and picked out a new melody on my Gibson. It wasn't angry this time, just quiet, like the sound of the tide pulling back. I didn't know what I was building, but it felt like a start. A few days later, I found myself on the beach, the sand cold under my boots as I walked the half-mile stretch from the bar to the water. The sky was a bruise of purples and grays, the kind of Oregon fall day that makes you feel small and infinite all at once. I'd rented a room at a cheap motel nearby, $80 a night, just to give Toby's place a break and get some space to think. I sat on a driftwood log, my guitar balanced on my knees, and started playing, letting the notes spill out into the wind. A couple of kids ran by, chasing a kite that dipped and swayed like it was drunk, and I watched them, wondering when I'd last felt that free. Toby showed up an hour later, plopping down beside me with a grunt. "You're tougher than you look, June," he said, cracking open a beer and handing me one. Always knew it. I took it, the cold aluminum biting my fingers. "Guess I'm finding out too," I said, and we clinked cans, the sound sharp against the roar of the sea. Lila texted me that afternoon, her message short and cryptic. "Come by, tea's on." I trudged over to her place, the little cottage next to mine with its jungle of wind chimes and ticking clocks. She opened the door before I could knock, her silver hair loose for once, and ushered me inside. The air smelled like chamomile and old wood, and she poured me a cup without asking. "You're not broken, June," she said, settling into her armchair, her eyes sharp behind those round glasses. "You're just shedding dead weight." I sipped the tea, letting her words settle. "Feels like I'm starting over," I admitted, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. She nodded, pointing to a clock on the mantel, its hands frozen at 3:15. "That stopped when I left my ex. Took me a year to fix it. You'll fix yourself faster." I didn't know if I believed her, but I wanted to. Word trickled in about Miles and Raven over the next week, bits and pieces I picked up from a bartender friend who knew one of Miles's co-workers. That fake Portland rental had hit his inbox like a brick. $1,500 he couldn't explain to his boss or his bank. Raven bailed on him 2 days after the bar fiasco, packing her camera and her smirk and vanishing back to California, leaving him with the mess. The co-worker said Miles lost his job soon after, the scandal from my song spreading like wildfire through his Portland office. I didn't feel sorry for him, not really. But I didn't feel good either. Just empty, like a song with no bridge. I started teaching guitar at the community center, a gig I stumbled into when a mom overheard me playing on the beach and asked if I'd show her kid a few chords. It paid $20 an hour, cash under the table, and I found myself smiling again, watching those little hands fumble over the strings. One girl, maybe 10, with freckles and a gap-toothed grin, nailed her first G chord after a week, and the pride in her eyes hit me harder than any applause at the Rusty Anchor. I'd sit there after class, strumming alone in the empty room, and feel the pieces of me stitching back together, slow but sure. The ocean kept rolling in, the wind kept howling, and I kept playing. Not for Miles or Raven or anyone else, but for me. By the time the week ended, I'd decided I wasn't going back to that house. Not to live. It was mine, sure, bought with the scraps of my old hit, but it felt like a museum of a life I didn't fit into anymore. I called a realtor, started the paperwork to sell, and let the idea of something new take root. Miles and Raven were falling apart, and I was picking myself up, one note at a time. The fall stretched on, cold and relentless, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I'd faced the storm and walked out the other side, bruised but still standing. The fall deepened into a gray, relentless blur, but I found my rhythm in it, the way you do when the world stops spinning long enough to let you stand upright again. I'd sold the house by mid-November, the realtor handing me a check for $2,500 that felt heavier than it should have. I didn't linger on the porch or run my fingers along the walls one last time. I just signed the papers and walked away, my guitar slung over my back like a shield. That money became my lifeline, and I poured it into something new. A tiny studio on the edge of Cannon Beach, a 500-square-foot space with peeling paint and a view of the pines I named Driftwood Chords. It was mine, every inch of it, and I filled it with second-hand amps, a rickety desk, and the sound of strings humming through the air. Miles showed up one afternoon, uninvited, his truck rattling into the gravel lot outside the studio like a ghost I'd tried to bury. I was mid-lesson, teaching a scrappy 12-year-old named Ethan how to slide into a D chord, when I saw him through the window. His hair wilder than I remembered, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been regret. He stepped inside, hands shoved in his pockets, and waited until Ethan's mom picked him up before speaking. "June," he said, his voice rough, I miss you. The house is empty without you. I set my Gibson down, leaning it against the stool, and crossed my arms, feeling the weight of every lie he'd told settle between us. Miss me? I said, my tone dry as the sand outside. Funny, you didn't miss me when Raven was lighting up your nights. He flinched, rubbing his neck like he could erase the past with the gesture. I was wrong, he said. I see that now. Can we try again? I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who'd built bridges for a living but couldn't hold up the one we'd made together. No, I said, simple and final. You don't get to walk back in here like nothing happened. Keep your memories, Miles. I've got my own to make. He stood there, silent, then nodded once and left, the door creaking shut behind him. I watched his truck disappear down the road, a strange relief washing over me, like shedding a jacket that never fit right. Days turned into weeks, and driftwood chords became my world. I taught kids like Ethan, their clumsy fingers finding magic in the strings, and recorded my own stuff at night, the mic picking up the hiss of the ocean through the cracked window. One evening I played The Stranger in My Mirror for a handful of students, their wide eyes locked on me as the last note faded. They clapped, loud and messy, and I felt a spark I hadn't known I'd lost. Lila stopped by after, her silver hair catching the dim light as she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a pocket watch, its hands ticking steady and sure. "Time's yours now, June," she said, her smile soft but fierce. "Don't let anyone steal it." I held that watch, the weight of it grounding me, and stepped outside into the dusk. The wind whipped through the pines, carrying the salt of the sea, and I breathed it in deep. Miles was gone, Raven too, their lives a wreck I didn't need to witness to know about. I'd heard whispers, her ditching him, his job crumbling, their mess sinking like a ship with no anchor. Me? I was standing tall, my boots firm on this rocky shore, my music alive again. Driftwood Chords wasn't just a place. It was a promise. A new song. I'd write one chord at a time, free and unbroken under this endless Oregon sky.